I'm Tiffany, and this is Towering TBR. Today, I'm going to be talking about my reaction to the first part in Don Quixote. If you've been following me for a while, you know that Don Quixote has been on my TBR for a really long time. It's an incredibly intimidating book because it is so lengthy, almost 1,000 pages, and I have a lot of thoughts. So I've decided I'm going to do kind of a chapter by chapter reaction to Don Quixote. This is going to contain spoilers because I'm going to be talking about details from nearly the first half of the book. But because it's so episodic, it's kind of hard, in my opinion, to spoil it because, uh, even if you know a couple of the adventures, it doesn't tell the whole story. But, if you're a person who's like, I'm not going to commit to 1,000 pages, but I'd like to know the story and see the influence that it has in our other media that we've seen, then this is the video for you. Or if you've already read Don Quixote and you're like, ooh, I wonder what she thought of that part. If it's in part 1, I will be talking about it. If you want to read Don Quixote with no spoilers, then maybe save this video for after you've read it. Because, yeah, lots of spoilers. So I'm going to talk about chapter 1 and chapter 2 combined. The book opens up with poems, and these are said to be like collected poems about Don Quixote. And we are told by the narrator that Don Quixote was a real person. He really existed, and the author is trying to find records of his adventures. And after each chapter is like a subheading, and it's like, oh, the one where Don Quixote does blah, blah, blah. They don't say the one where, but it kind of reminded me of like the Friends titling of episodes. The one where
we were on a break!
Don Quixote has read so many books about knight errants, and he decides he wants to go out and be an errant knight. Errant because he doesn't have a kingdom or a lord or anybody that he is serving. He is just kind of a rogue knight, just somebody who goes on adventures. And he wholeheartedly believes that everything that has happened in chivalric novels that contain knights and monsters and giants and princesses and damsels in distress, like he believes all of that is real. It all existed back in the day, and he wants basically a renaissance. He wants it to come back, and so he's going to go on his adventure. So he stops at an inn after riding his horse Rocinante for a couple of hours or so. He stops at an inn, and he sees 2 sex workers outside of the inn, and he thinks that the inn is a castle and that the 2 women are ladies in waiting. He really wants to be like announced to this castle, and there's a pig farmer who is like using a trumpet in the fields, and he's like, oh, it's heralding my arrival. The trumpet sounds for my arrival. And it's just, he's so arrogant and conceited. And it's really funny. Like, this book is a satire, and I've laughed multiple times out loud. It's really quite a funny book. He also speaks a lot of the time as if he is a knight with the thou sayest and, the older English stuff. And so everybody's like, why is he talking this way? Why is he being such a weirdo? Like, nobody's buying into it at this time. I did make a connection with the narrator discovering the book and uncovering these sources. I thought about Princess Bride, and that's how Princess Bride, the book, starts out, is the narrator is looking for the Princess Bride book to give as a gift to somebody. And then once he gets the book, we then dive in and know the story of the book. And I was like, that was probably influenced from Don Quixote. And I'm just curious what other things have maybe been influenced by Don Quixote since it's been around for, 500 years. So anyways, he gets a room at the inn, and the 2 sex workers are trying to help him take off his armor. And he takes off most of the armor, but he won't let them take his helmet because he has lashed it to his head with rope. And if they cut the rope, then he won't be able to wear the helmet. He won't be able to reattach it. So he's just like stubbornly laying in bed. I'm like envisioning he's like just got his arms crossed, just laying in bed with this horribly uncomfortable helmet on that he made and lashed to his head. Apparently my note said absolute buffoonery. I just Yeah. Chapter 3, the one in which Don Quixote is dubbed a knight. The innkeeper asks Don Quixote if he is prepared for his journey at all. Does he have money? Does he have food? Does he have provisions? And he's like, "Oh, well, that's not in the books. I don't need any of that." And he's like, "Oh, well, that's not in the books. They don't ever say that they're carrying money or provisions or talking about when they need to eat or use the restroom." And it's like, "But you still need to do those things." And the innkeeper's like mad because Don Quixote doesn't have money, and so he's obviously not going to pay for the room. And he's like, "No, no, you need to go back home, get provisions, be prepared, and then go out on this journey." He decides he's going to do that, but first he wants to be dubbed a knight. And so the innkeeper's like, "Yeah, sure, whatever, I'll dub you a knight." And he's like, "No, no, no, no. I must first stand vigil over my armor." So he goes out to the barn. He puts his armor like on a pig trough and he stands vigil over his stuff. And in the wee hours of the morning, the farmer needs to feed the pigs, tries to come in and move the armor off the pig trough so he can feed the pigs. But as soon as he touches the armor, Don Quixote is his honor has been insulted and he attacks the man. So he like knocks him out and then goes back to just standing vigil over his stuff. And then a second guy comes in and he's like, "We really got to feed these pigs. What's going on?" And so he tries to move this stuff. And then Don Quixote attacks him as well. And so the innkeeper, who is just like wanting to get rid of Don Quixote as soon as possible, is like, "All right, you've stood vigil over your stuff long enough. I will dub you a knight." And so he dubs him a knight. And Don Quixote is like, "All right, I'm going to go back home, get all my provisions, and then make my next journey out." Oh, he also decides that one of the sex workers, whose name is not Dulcinea, he names her Dulcinea of Toboso, the city where she's from, and decides that she's going to be his lady love, his muse, and basically inspire him to do all of his chivalric good in her name. They met once at the inn, but they didn't have any kind of relationship. It's unclear if they even really talked to each other. But he's just decided right now she's gonna be his lady love, which was silly. Chapter 4. So he is on his way back home, and on his way, he sees a man whipping a teen boy who is lashed to a tree. And he decides he needs to intervene. And so he says, "Why are you whipping this boy?" And he said that he was one of the workers, but he's been lazy. He's not been doing his work. And so he's punishing him. And the kid cries out, "I haven't been doing the work because he's been refusing to pay me. So he was withholding labor until he was able to get paid." And so Don Quixote is like all affronted and he orders the man to pay all of the back wages to the kid that he owes him and to stop beating him. And once the debt is settled up, then the worker will go back to work and everything will be fine. However, he then leaves after this proclamation, which basically makes it unenforceable, and the man just beats the kid harder. And nobody was better for that situation. So then he goes on a little bit further and there's a crowd of people and he declares that his Dulcinea of Toboso is the most beautiful woman he's ever seen and that everybody around him must declare that she is the most beautiful woman alive. He says specifically, "Confess that there is no damsel more beauteous than the Empress of La Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea of Toboso." And the men are like, "We can't really say she's the most beautiful because we've never seen her. We've never met her. We don't know this, so we can't really proclaim it exactly." And Don Quixote gets super offended and he's like, "You have slighted me and my lady love." And so he charges at him on his horse with the lance. But shortly before he gets to the man, Rocinante trips and they fall and he breaks his lance. And the man who was going to be attacked, picks up broken pieces of his lance and starts beating Don Quixote with it. Part of me felt justified because his anger and his entitlement and his arrogance, like, I feel like he needed to be taken down a peg. But of course, he just blames his horse. He's like, if my horse hadn't fallen, I would have been fine. That was unsuccessful as well. So he finally slinks back home, and he's at his home when his barber and his priest come by, and they've been worried. He's been gone for days, and they didn't know where he was. So they're like, "Oh, you're home. Yay." And he's like, "Well, I'm just home to refuel, to pick up provisions, but I'm going back out." And then he goes to bed. So the barber and his priest, real nosy busybody people, decide that they are going to burn all of his chivalry books as a way to maybe take away the madness of Don Quixote. If the books don't exist anymore, then he might be cured. So while he's sleeping, they're in his room throwing books out the window for a big burn pile. And I think this is where some of the book was a little bit lost for me, because they were talking a lot about current 15th century writers who wrote this type of stuff. And even though I follow the footnotes and this was so and so and he was a contemporary of Cervantes, I think I missed some of that. However, I definitely didn't miss on the satire when the priest and the barber would occasionally pick up a book, be like, "Oh, no, no, that one's too good to burn. We can't burn that one." It's like they're blaming the books of chivalry for the madness of Don Quixote, but also admit that they like some books of chivalry. It was very hypocritical. The author was definitely roasting other authors and saying that they deserve to be burned or deserve not. I'm sure it was full of tea, but I missed some of those references for sure. I marked a quote that I thought was funny. It says, "Your Grace should send them to be burned just like all of the rest, because it's very likely that my dear uncle, having been cured of the chivalric disease, will read these and want to become a shepherd and wander through the woods and meadows, singing and playing. And what would be even worse, become a poet. And that, they say, is an incurable and contagious disease." I just thought was really funny. They also mention, whilst they're going through his bookshelf, another book that Cervantes wrote. And they were saying that the author was a close personal friend of Don Quixote's. So there's a lot of meta text that I really liked. But I think the story is still fun even if you don't get all of that. Chapter 7, the one where they gaslight him. So, anyways, he wakes up as they're throwing his books to be burned, and they also wall off the rest of the library. And when he tries to go to his library in his house, it's not there. And they're like, "Oh, it was enchanted away. It doesn't exist anymore because of magic." Which, for some reason, Don Quixote believes, because, like I told you, he's delusional. And we get to meet Sancho, who is Don Quixote's neighbor, and he decides to be his squire. And Don Quixote is saying, like, "Oh, if you are my squire, once I win lands, I will make you, basically, I will give you land and title for your service to me." He promises it and says that he believes he will win a kingdom in as little as 6 days, so he doesn't have to wait long. I just wrote Sancho is dumb. I shouldn't say dumb. He's gullible. He's incredibly gullible. So, chapter 8, the one with the windmill, and this is my favorite chapter so far. So, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza decide to set out on their next adventure. After they've traveled a little ways, Don Quixote says that he sees giants off in the distance and that he needs to go and fight these giants. And Sancho's like, "No, DQ, those aren't giants, those are windmills." He's like, "No, no, no. They've been enchanted to look like windmills, but they're really giants." So, he decides that he is going to charge them on his horse with his lance. And he does. He charges the windmill, and his lance shatters into lots of different pieces, and he falls off his horse and is a little bit banged up about it. And Sancho is like, "Dude, I told you they were windmills. Why did you attack a windmill?" And he's like, enchanted them to look like windmills and to turn back into windmills, but they really were giants. They're just like, okie doke. After he picks himself together, and I guess maybe puts his lance together, because he'll have that for future chapters, he comes across some monks and he challenges the monks. But what was really interesting about this chapter is it fades to black. Like they get into a fight and it looks like Don Quixote is losing because he's being beaten up by these monks. And then it fades to black as if like whoever was the scribe didn't know how the fight had ended, which I kind of thought was like a fade to black was kind of lazy, but I don't know. Like I just don't know how else that could have ended. Chapter 9. So in the following chapter, the narrator talks about how these stories were found and that they mentioned that they needed a scribe to write down these adventures. And it really reminded me of Our Flag Means Death. If you've seen it, Steed, a wealthy owner, decides he wants to be a pirate, and he hires a man to come on the boat to write down all of his adventures. And so, while it isn't said who wrote these down until much later, like it's curious. That's what it reminded me of. Oh, I need a scribe so that everybody knows about my adventures. In chapter 10, I'm going to start calling him DQ because Don Quixote is a lot to say. My husband said, why not just call him Don? But Don is actually a prefix, like Mr. So it would be like Mr. Quixote. So that's why I don't call him Don. Anywho, DQ, he says he wants vengeance for something or other. Sancho talks him out of it, and DQ says, you have spoken very well and to the point. And so I revoke the part of my vow that deals with wreaking new vengeance on him, but I will make it and confirm it again with regard to leading the life I had mentioned, until such time as I take by force another helmet as good as this one from some other knight. So it was the first occasion that Sancho actually was able to be reasonable and talk Don Quixote out of doing something impulsive and irrational, which I thought was kind of important. Chapter 11, a random goat herd tells a story and recites some poetry. Chapter 12, so it was about this shepherdess, Marcella, and she's so beautiful that men call her cruel and ungrateful because they want to be with her, and she's like, nah, I'm not interested. And they're like, oh, she's horrible. And it just reminded me really kind of like of incels, like OG incels, basically. Chapter 13, DQ has said that Dulcinea of Toboso is his lady love, but he talks about her beauty in like such a really creepy way. He says things like tresses gold, her forehead Elysian fields, her eyebrows the arches of heaven, her eyes suns, her cheek roses, her lips coral, her teeth pearls, her neck alabaster, her bosom marble, her hands ivory. And I was thinking, if you actually put in all of those components, that would be one freaky looking person. Like, doesn't sound beautiful at all. So, back to the haughty shepherdess in chapter 14. So, a dude wrote a poem/suicide note, and he killed himself because Marcella turned him down. And there's a whole song about it. But Marcella stands up for herself, which I really liked. She says, according to what I have heard, true love is not divided and must be voluntary, not forced. If this is true, as I believe it is, why do you want to force me to surrender my will, obliged to do so simply because you say you love me? But if this is not true, then tell me, if the heaven that made me beautiful had made me ugly instead, would you consider it fair for me to complain that none of you loved me? Moreover, you must consider that I did not choose the beauty I have, such as it is, and heaven gave it to me freely without my requesting or choosing it. So she's basically like, I didn't want to be hot necessarily. I didn't ask to be this. Uh, how dare you assume you're entitled to something because I am beautiful to you? And I was like, yay. This book is filled with a lot of misogyny. And so having her stand up for herself like that was really refreshing. All right, I'm going to skip some chapters because I didn't take any notes. So we're going to go to chapter 18. Don Quixote sees some sheep in a field. And he decides that this is his mortal enemy and they're creeping up on him and he needs to attack. He gets on his horse and he charges at the sheep. And so the shepherds who are out in the fields decide to start throwing rocks at him because he's like, stop messing with our sheep. Sancho's even like, dude, those are sheep. You don't need to attack them. But this time, Don Quixote doesn't listen and he gets really, really beat up from all the rocks that they throw. He says he was tricked, that they were enchanted to be the enemy, and then they turned back into sheep once he started attacking them. He really believes in magic and enchantments a lot because otherwise he's just losing a lot. So, chapter 19, he gets into a scrape with somebody, attacks them for some reason, and he breaks the man's leg. And the man says, I don't know how you can speak of righting wrongs, for you have certainly wronged me and broken my leg, which won't ever be right again. And in rectifying my injuries, you have injured me so much that I'll go on being injured for the rest of my life. It was a great misadventure for me to run across a man who was seeking adventures. And at this point, Sancho gives Don Quixote the nickname of the Knight of the Sorrowful Face. Because, Don Quixote keeps losing a lot, so he's, down about it. Chapter 20, we've got some more misogyny. I wrote down that Don Quixote says, that is the nature of women. They reject the man who loves them and love the man who despises them. Which, that thought still persists now, which is really quite sad. But all right, chapter 21. So Don Quixote full on has this daydream / hallucination. And it really reminded me of Scrubs when JD would just go in his head and completely invent this story or reinvent something that happened, but like change it. And it was such a long daydream. But essentially he was like, I am going to fight to save a princess. And if the king doesn't award me, like allow me to marry his daughter, I will kidnap her. And it was a long daydream that was not based in reality at all. But I found it really funny. It sort of reminded me of like when I'm in the shower and I have like pretend conversations or arguments with people, like how I should have said something, except for this was a whole long scenario. I wrote, Sancho is falling into this like an MLM. He's dumb. Every time Don Quixote loses an interaction, Sancho's like, when are we going to be getting this land that you promised me? Like, you're not winning anything. And so, yeah. Don Quixote's like, oh, it's taking a little longer than normal, but it'll be fine. And Sancho just keeps believing him. So, along the road, DQ and Sancho see the king's galley slaves. So these are criminals who have been sentenced to hard labor for their crimes. And they're all chained together. So when DQ sees this, he's like, oh, these people are bonded and enslaved, and I must rescue them. So he comes up to the king's man who is, leading the slaves, and he's like, I demand you set these people free. He's like, dude, these are the king's slaves. Like, they've been doing crime, and now they're doing the punishment. And he's like, no, it's injustice, and you must free them. And they're like, you're crazy. Like, I'm not doing that. Because he's crazy, he decided to charge right at them and unlock one of the keys. And so once some of the galley slaves get free, they free the others, and everything becomes chaotic and a mess. Then the criminals, obviously, beat and steal from Don Quixote and Sancho. His donkey, Sancho's donkey, is stolen, as well as provisions and other things, and they're beat up quite badly. Then we get to, I'm going to skip a little. We're going to go to chapter 25. Nearly 200 pages in now. And Sancho is just now questioning Don Quixote. He's like, I believed you about all this errant knight stuff, but they've come across a barber. Not Don Quixote's barber, but another barber. and he has with him a barber's basin. And he challenges the dude and takes the basin, and he puts it on his head, and he calls it the helmet of Mambrino. And Sancho's like, wait, that's not a helmet. That's definitely a barber's basin. If you think that's a helmet, maybe all the other things you think are not true too. And so he's starting to question him finally. They settle at a spot, and Don Quixote is like, you must go and tell my lady love, Dulcinea of Toboso, that I am mad about her. I am crazy in love with her, and tell her all the crazy things I do. And Sancho's like, all right, I'll go find this lady. And he's like, no, wait, I have to do something crazy first. So he takes his pants off and starts doing cartwheels. And I wrote, naked cartwheels for love. What more could Dulcinea of Toboso want? That was just utterly laugh out loud funny. All right, so then after that, they run into some people. There's a lot of coincidences. So-and-so is related to so-and-so, or so-and-so wants to marry so-and-so. And in these stories that are basically like backstories of characters we're meeting, one of the women says, I should just submit anyway, because otherwise he'll rape me anyway, so maybe I should just submit. And I was like, that's gross. Ugh. That's why I celebrated when Marcella fought back, because there's just so much misogyny in this book. Chapter 29, I only wrote Sancho is gullible, because he is now professing that he believes DQ is going to become an emperor. And so the priest and the barber, Don Quixote's priest and barber, have now caught up to them, and they are basically trying to bring him back. They're like, we'll just follow with him, keep him safe, and see if we can bring him back home to cure his madness. At this point, the priest is like, I can't believe Sancho's falling for all of this. Like, what is going on? The priest and the barber, they just keep lying all the time. They are like feeding into Don Quixote's delusion, which, if they want to cure him, makes no sense. I think they're just kind of doing it for fun. Like, they like to make fun of him. At one point, he's wearing a disguise, and it's like animal hair that he fashions into a beard. And when he reaffixes it, because it was a costume, Don Quixote is like, what was that? And he's like, oh, it was a spell to reattach beards. And he's like, oh, you should teach me that. I might need to know that. I don't really know why they're feeding into his delusions, but it does make for some entertaining stuff. Skipping now to chapter 31, I wrote down, Sancho says, that's the way. I've heard it said in sermons that we should love our Lord for himself alone, not because we hope for glory or are afraid of punishment. But I'd rather love and serve him for what he can do. And I thought, wow, that's really honest, especially because there's a lot of religion in this book. Chapter 32. They are all at an inn now. The barber, the priest, Don Quixote, Sancho, and some random people they met. They're all talking about like books of chivalry and the potential evils that can like infect the mind. And the innkeeper says, but if you want to burn one, let it be one of the ones about the great captain and the Diego Garcia, because I'd rather let a child of mine be burned than either one of those. And I'm like, seriously? You would rather your kid be burned than two books that you think are really great? Like, I love books, but not that much. They get into a big argument about which chivalric hero was the best. And it kind of reminded me of like Big Bang Theory, where they're like all talking about different superheroes and how they'd stack up against a different superhero.
Thor versus Indiana Jones.
And like, no, my guy's the best. And yeah, it was just really funny too. Chapter 33, the one with the book called The Man Who Was Recklessly Curious. So I've said there's been like books in books, but this is like the first like story book in the middle of the book, and it's called The Man Who Was Recklessly Curious. In the footnotes, it said that Cervantes was criticized for interrupting the plot. So the story is about a man, and he's married, and he wants to test the loyalty of his wife. So he asks his best friend to basically hit on her and see if she's tempted. And he's like, no, 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 no. I'm not going to do this. She's going to think lower of me. And there's only room for heartache. Like, I'm not doing this. And he's like, no, I'm gonna test her loyalty with somebody. And he's like, all right, I guess it should be me because, he I don't know. He changes his mind and he's like, all right, I guess if you're gonna do it anyway, I'll be part of it. So he tempts the wife. She says no. He tempts the wife some more. She says no. And he decides he's just not gonna really put any effort into it anymore and just lie to his friend. And ultimately, he falls in love with his friend's wife and they do cheat. It was just, I'm not really sure why I was at it. We also get some more backstory on the people at the inn. There is a slave who helps spirit away a wealthy woman, and in doing so, gets to marry her. But the slave went to the rich man's house, who the daughter was stuck there, and he pretends he's gonna forage for food on the land, and the rich guy is just cool with it. He's like, yeah, yeah, forage. I've got good stuff.
Absolutely, old sport.
So that was his pretext for going to the house so that he could then rescue the woman. The rich guy letting him forage, that makes no sense. I don't know. But we hear about some pirates, and then in a footnote, it says that Cervantes, the author of the book, was actually captured by pirates and he was ransomed himself. And so that information was really interesting. All right. I'm going to skip a bunch of chapters now and head out to chapter 42. I just wrote, the priest never tells the truth, which is the case. He is constantly feeding into Don Quixote's illusions, or delusions, I should say. And when anybody dares to say, like, hey, none of that stuff in the books happened, that's just false. That's just lies. It's just a story. The priest and or the barber will be like, no, I've heard of that too, or whatever. They'll back him up essentially, but they're all lying. Chapter 44, I wrote way too many coincidences. Like, oh, you happen to want to marry this person and they want to marry this person, and they just need to swap essentially. It was weird. So I wrote, DQ gets into a fight, but then stops and says, it is not licit for me to use my sword against squirely folk. Summon my squire Sancho for this defense because this revenge rightfully belongs to him. And I was just like, coward! Like, I know you get beat up a lot, but to start a fight and then be like, oh, I can't do this. I'm too highborn or whatever. Chapter 45. The helmet of Mambrino comes back into the story. And the priest and the barber lie to the man who owned the basin and said, no, that's the helmet of Mambrino. Yeah, they're completely just encouraging his delusions at this point. And they gaslight the man. And he was like, oh, he never stole that from you. This has always been his helmet. So Don Quixote's lance shatters again. I don't know what this thing is made out of. Glass? I wrote, why so brittle? And then it devolves into like a really large chaotic fight. And I wrote, think Anchorman fight. Chapter 46, the Holy Brotherhood, who are kind of the police of the land. They arrest Don Quixote because he freed the galley slaves, and that's a crime. But the priest talk them out of it and say, oh, he's crazy, so he shouldn't have to be accountable for his actions. He like pays off the tab for the innkeeper and the basin that got stolen. And I'm like, where is he getting this money to pay off Don Quixote's tab? Because he's a priest. And he's just paying for a bunch of things that Don Quixote has like destroyed or stolen. So anyways, Don Quixote comes out with one of his rages. And they're incredibly dramatic monologues. Oh, base, lowborn, wretched, rude, ignorant, foul-mouthed, ill-spoken, slanderous, insolent varlet. You have dared to speak such words in my presence and in the presence of these distinguished ladies? Dared to fill befuddled imaginations with such vileness and effrontery? Leave my presence, O unholy monster, repository of lies, stronghold of falsehoods, storehouse of deceits, inventor of iniquities, promulgator of insolence, enemy of decorum, owed to these royal persons. Go and do not appear before me under pain of my wrath. So I wanted to get a taste of, like, how Don Quixote speaks because it's a big deal that he speaks in, like, older language, and they're like, "Why are you talking like a weirdo?" Chapter 48, we come across a canon, which I don't know what that means, but I think it's some sort of religious leader from context. So he and the priest start chatting about books of chivalry. And the canon's like, "I hate them. They're terrible." And the priest is like, "Yeah, you see what they've done to Don Quixote. They've infected him with madness." But then the canon admits that he's already written about 100 pages of his own chivalric novel. I'm just like, what hypocrites! How do you in one breath say that you hate them and that they're infecting people with madness, and then like, "Oh yeah, I'm also writing one." So I wrote that Don Quixote is blaming a lot of his misfortune on enchantments and being mystified. And I said, this is really getting hard for me to suspend my disbelief that he is believing so much in enchantments. But then on the very next page, DQ says to Sancho, it has to be enchantments or otherwise I'm weak. And he just can't think of that of himself. He is so narcissistic that he's like, nah, it's got to be magic. It can't be me. Nearly there. Chapter 50. I find myself wanting to argue with Don Quixote. A lot of characters do. They do argue that chivalry and the stuff in books didn't actually happen. I found myself in that same position. Like, no, that doesn't make sense. But it reminds me of people who are in cults. Like, if they have a way of thinking, it's not usually because it's rational. So you can't use reason to get them out of that belief. And I was just like, he seems like he's in a cult. That's how steadfast he is to these beliefs. Wrote chapter 1, a story obsessed over virginity. For his daughter had preserved that jewel that once lost can never be recovered. Which, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that they put a big thing on virginity, but it was still gross and misogynistic. And the last chapter in part 1, chapter 52. Today on the episode of DQ Thinks Things Are Other Things, he sees a funeral procession and they have flags, that they're a flag and a banner that they've got. And he thinks that this banner is a woman in a shroud that they are keeping against her will. And he's like, I demand you give her the freedom she desires and deserves. And they just all laugh at him because they're like, dude, this is a flag. This is not a lady. At the end of that, the priest, the barber, Sancho, and DQ start heading back home. And when Sancho Panza returns to his wife, she immediately is concerned that the donkey is missing. She's like, how much money did you make? Where's our donkey? What did you get from this experience? She was a really strong character, and I really liked her. That is how the end of part 1 ends. And I have lots of thoughts on the second part. I don't think I'm going to do another chapter by chapter because I don't want to point out all the best bits of the story, because if you're going to read it, I want you to discover some of those on your own. If you're interested in seeing my reactions to part 2, because I have definitely taken quite a lot of notes, let me know down in the comments below. If you were assigned to read Don Quixote, know that I skipped several chapters and that was not the equivalent of Spark Notes for you. So I'm enjoying this book quite a lot. It is very long and some of the chapters are not as funny or as exciting as others, but this has been a really fun reading experience and it's helped me confront books that I'm intimidated by. If you've read Don Quixote, let me know down in the comments. What did you like about it or not like about it if you didn't care for it? And if you haven't read Don Quixote, did I wet your whistle enough that you're like, maybe I'll check that out someday? I'm curious to know.